We've spent a pretty good amount of time now with the root bridge election. We've done a walkthrough, and then we saw the results of an election on live equipment. And now we're going to spend a little bit of time examining how that root port on switch 2 was selected. I've also added a switch to the lab, kind of impromptu, because I want to show you some of this to go along with the illustrations that we'll have in a moment. And then we'll need to take that third switch out of the lab. But that's no problem. We'll just close a couple of ports. Now, how did we get those costs then, or how did we get to that root port on switch 2? Because there was a fast Ethernet 11 and a fast Ethernet 12, and we know that it chose 11 as the root and 12 was then blocked. Well, every port on our switches has an assigned path cost, and that cost is used to arrive at the root path cost for a port. So, we've got two terms that sound a lot alike here. We have path cost and then root path cost. The path cost is assigned to an individual port. This is strictly a local value and is not advertised to upstream or downstream switches in any way. A port's path cost is assigned in accordance with the speed of the port. The faster the port, the lower the path cost. And we saw some path costs here actually. Let me move that over a little bit. Here's one on switch 3, but I just want to show you where they all are. There's your cost right under show spanning VLAN. And I can run that here on one as well. And you can see right here we've got a path cost of 19. Now that is the default cost for a fast Ethernet port. I'm going to give you some other costs here in this section, and if you ever see any that don't match this list or aren't on this list, you'll need to check Cisco's website for that for production work to see where they came up with that number. Now, the root path cost, that is a cumulative value, and that reflects the overall cost for a given port to reach the root. It's that configuration BPDU we've been talking about that actually carries the root path cost, and that cost increments as that BPDU is forwarded throughout the network. So that's another one of those things where you read the theory and you go, okay, I think I got that. Can we see an example? We're going to see one right now, because in this particular example, and again, I'll bring the walkthrough up in a moment. What happens here is our root bridge generates a BPDU with a root path cost of 0. Remember, it's only the root bridge that generates the BPDU. That's why I was being so hard-headed about that early, kind of hitting you over the head with a little bit, because it's important to remember that, because when the root bridge generates that BPDU, it does have a root path cost of 0. Now, that new root path cost is going to be reflected in the BPDU as it is forwarded, because switch 2 gets that BPDU, and I added this third switch. So switch 1's connected to switch 2 is connected to switch 3 and switch 1 are not connected in this lab. And in that example, the root path cost goes from 0 to 19 to 38. Now this path cost on the ports, that is locally significant only. Switch 3 doesn't have any idea what the path cost on switch 2's receiving interface is, nor does it care. No switch downstream of switch 3 is going to know any of the individual path costs on switch 2 or 3. The downstream switches will only see that cumulative cost, the root path cost, that is carried by the BPDU. Super important here. The BPDU, the path cost increments as the BPDU is received, not as it is sent. So let's see that in action. Let's bring router 1 up here again, or excuse me, switch 1. And we don't see anything about a path cost here in the root ID information. That's because we're on the root and there is really no path cost yet. So we know now that switch 1 originates that BPDU and then sends it downstream. It's going to get to switch 2. So let's go over to switch 2. Let's try switch 2. And all of a sudden we see a little cost here in the middle of that information. And that's because as it came in, it incremented, that path cost incremented to 19. So now I do have switches 2 and 3 connected. And we're going to go down to switch 3 and run the same command. And now you can see that cost is incremented to 38. So that is how that happens. Again, the BPDU is originated, the config BPDU originated by the root, it's sent out, it has no root path cost. Then the path cost is added of the receiving interface on the downstream switch is added to it, and then as it's forwarded, it's continually added as the frame arrives at the switch, not as it leaves. So before we move forward, I am going to take switch 2. I hate that dinging too. Let's take switch 2. And we know that switch 3 is connected to fast 010, so for right now, I'm just going to take that right out of the equation, and we're right back to the 2-switch network that we had. And let's flip back to that, because we're going to come back here to the live equipment in just a moment. But here is our 2-switch example. You know, we've got one port that's blocked, and the incoming root path cost, of course, should be the same for both ports on switch 2, because every port involved here is a fast Ethernet port. So let's take a look at that. Actually, we just did, but... And we'll see that, you know, here are the port costs, and it's 19 for each one. So we've got a tie there, and if the path cost is 19 for each port, why was port 11 chosen as the root port over 12? And here's why. It's a pretty detailed list here. First off, the port that receives the superior BPDU, that is the BPDU containing the lowest bid, will be chosen as the root. Well, fast 11 and fast 12 are both getting them from switch 1, so that's a tie. Next off, we're going to choose the port with the lowest root path cost. That's a tie because both ports have a root path cost of 19. It was incremented as the BPDUs came into switch 2. So switch 2 is saying, hey, I got 2 different ports where I have an overall root path cost of 19. Okay. The next tiebreaker is to choose the port receiving the BPDU with the lowest sender bid. Well, we got a tie there because both ports receive their BPDUs directly from switch 1. And here's what we usually come down to, especially in a lab network, a smaller network, the lowest sender port ID. Well, there's your tiebreaker because 11 is lower than 12. So switch 1 sent those out fast 011 and fast 012, and that is why 011 was chosen. Now, what we're going to do is go through a walkthrough here with 3 switches. It's not the config that we saw earlier in this vid, though. Be careful about this. We're going to walk through on it. All ports are fast Ethernet ports with a path cost of 19. So switch 1 connected to switch 2, 2 connected to 3, 3 connected to 1. With all path costs the same, we can eyeball this and say, okay, I know where the root ports are on switch 2 and switch 3. And the root ports are always in forwarding mode. So I know that on switch 2, fast Ethernet 2 is going to be my root. I know on switch 3, fast Ethernet 3 is going to be my root. We also know the ports on the root bridge are not root ports. They're designated ports, DESG, and they are also in forwarding mode. Well, right now, at this point, we've got 4 ports in forwarding mode, so STP better get a little busy here about putting a port or 2 in blocking mode. Now, speaking of designated ports, we actually need one of those for the segment connecting switches 2 and 3. We only need one, just in case, and I freely admit this is an unlikely scenario, but I want to show you how this gets chosen, or why we need a designated port there. If we had this scenario where we had users connected to a shared network segment with 2 switches on it, frames coming from that host onto the segment could cause a switching loop if they both start forwarding frames from that host to switch 1. We can end up with a real mess. That's where the designated port comes in, because it's the switch with the lowest root path cost that would have its port on this shared segment become the designated port. So we need either fast Ethernet 2 on switch 3 or fast Ethernet 3 on switch 2 to become the DP. Now in this scenario, we know that both switches are going to have the exact same root path cost. So we need a tiebreaker. And what we end up with is the port belonging to the switch with the lowest bid will become the designated port along with the ports on the root bridge. We already know that. Well, going with our example, we know that switch 2's bid is 32,768 with all 2s. Switch 3's by default 32,768 with all 3s. So switch 2's port on that shared segment becomes the DP. Sorry for the white space, but the diagram's pretty big here. And this is what we end up with in that scenario. we have one lone non-designated port down there on switch 3 that's in blocking mode. Now, of the 6 ports, 5 of them are in forwarding mode. Only one of them is blocked, but placing that one particular port into blocking mode is going to prevent switching loops from forming. And of course, putting just one of the 2 ports on the switch 2, switch 3 shared segment into blocking mode makes the cutover to that path for switch 3 a little quicker should the current path from 3 to 1 become unavailable. So watch out for that, because it's really easy to think, oh, 2 ports going to be in blocking mode. Not necessarily, and certainly not in this case. In the very next video, what are we going to look at? Got a Zen lesson for you. Because I did say with this one, we're assuming that all ports are fast Ethernet ports. But that's not always the case, and your eyes can fool you. You can't always eyeball a network drawing and say, okay, I know this is true. You might not, and we'll talk about exactly what I'm talking about in the very next video. See you there.